I am Elise Dubois, 16 years old, a high school student in the quiet suburbs of Paris. That morning in October, the sky hung heavy with a muted gray, as if the city itself sensed the weight of what was about to unfold. I walked down the familiar corridor of our school, my backpack snug against my shoulders, earbuds tucked away, listening only to the rhythm of my own footsteps. Everything seemed ordinary, students chatting in clusters, the soft hum of lockers closing and opening, but beneath that mundane surface, the air carried an unspoken tension I hadn't noticed before. Entering the science classroom, I felt the usual mix of anticipation and boredom. The wooden desks smelled faintly of chalk and polish, and the faint sunlight struggled through the tall windows, casting pale rectangles across the floor. I found my seat near the back, hoping to blend into the shadows, to remain unnoticed as always. I hadn't expected anything extraordinary to happen, just another day of experiments, notes, and half-hearted lectures. Yet, as I settled in, I caught a glimpse of something unusual on the teacher's desk. A folded envelope, edges slightly crumpled, as if it had been passed along in secret. I hesitated, curiosity prickling at my skin. Little did I know that small, inconspicuous envelope would mark the beginning of a day that would irrevocably change my life, unraveling truths I wasn't ready to face. If you're still listening, we want to sincerely thank you for spending your time with us. Truly means a lot. We'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments and let's see how far this message has reached. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, I highly recommend doing it now so you won't miss any of our upcoming stories. These aren't just ordinary stories. They're filled with meaningful life lessons that can inspire, teach, and stay with you long after the video ends. Hit that subscribe button and join our growing community. That day, our science class had a substitute teacher, Marianne Leclerc, a woman in her 40s with piercing eyes that seemed to cut straight through you, and a voice that carried an authority that demanded obedience. The moment she stepped into the classroom, her presence seemed to suck the air from the room. She handed out a document she called a total silence contract and instructed every student to sign it. The words were precise, formal, and chilling. Any breach would result in severe consequences. The room fell into uneasy murmurs as my classmates exchanged worried glances. I remember the oppressive quiet pressing against my chest as I signed the paper, feeling a strange mix of fear and defiance bubbling inside me. During the lesson, I noticed one of my classmates trembling, panicked over the upcoming test questions. Whispering softly, I tried to calm her, offering guidance and reassurance. Before I could process what had happened, Marianne Leclerc's eyes snapped toward me. Her expression was sharp, cold, almost predatory. "Stay after class," she commanded, her tone final and unyielding. I swallowed hard, heart thumping, knowing that even a simple act of kindness could be twisted into punishment under her watch. That moment was only the beginning. The real ordeal came during the lab experiment. Reaching into my bag for what I thought was my usual oat bar, I accidentally grabbed a protein bar that wasn't mine. I took a bite and instantly a bitter peanut butter flavor coated my tongue. Panic surged through me as I realized what I had done. I have a severe peanut allergy, a fact clearly documented in my school's medical records. "I need my EpiPen. Now," I shouted, my voice cracking with fear as the tightening in my throat escalated into a terrifying constriction. Marianne Leclerc, who had been casually nibbling on a packet of hazelnuts at the teacher's desk, glanced at me with an expression that was more disdain than concern. "Don't overreact, Elise. Allergies are just imaginary problems for spoiled children," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. I tried to explain, my words faltering as the swelling in my mouth and throat made speech nearly impossible. My vision blurred at the edges, and every inhale felt like drawing through a narrow, unyielding tube. Panic and disbelief collided inside me. I could not comprehend how someone could be so utterly indifferent to a life-threatening emergency happening right before their eyes. Classrooms seemed to shrink around me, the walls pressing in, desks looming like obstacles. I could hear the muffled gasps of my classmates, their whispers lost in the fog of fear clouding my mind. My hand shook uncontrollably as I reached for my bag, desperate for the little device that could save me. Each second felt stretched into eternity. Marianne's gaze remained icy, unmoved, as if my very struggle was an inconvenient distraction from her routine. I remember thinking in those terrifying moments that the world could be cruel in ways you never imagined, that authority could hide behind arrogance and ignorance, and that survival sometimes depended on your own instincts rather than anyone else's help. By the time a teacher from another class finally noticed the commotion and rushed in with the school nurse, my throat was already swelling dangerously, and my chest tightened with a suffocating pressure. Panic had reached a crescendo, my body betraying me even as my mind screamed for rescue. That day, the lesson was brutal and unforgettable. Cruelty can hide behind civility, and danger often comes not only from what you fear, but from those entrusted to protect you. Every school in France has an emergency medical cabinet, and ours was no exception. I knew for a fact it contained an EpiPen, my lifeline. My vision blurred at the edges, and my chest rose and fell in short, shallow gasps as I pointed desperately toward the white metal cabinet bolted near the door. "Please, open it!" I croaked, my voice breaking, already hoarse from the swelling in my throat. Marianne Leclerc stood up slowly, the sound of her chair scraping against the tiled floor echoing like a threat. For a fleeting moment, I thought she was going to help me, that maybe the flicker of humanity in her eyes would ignite into action. But instead, she moved toward the cabinet with a measured, deliberate pace, and then stepped directly in front of it, her body forming a barricade. "When I was your age," she began, her tone low and clinical, "my parents locked me in a kennel with our dogs to cure my pet dander allergies. I survived. I overcame. You will too." Her voice was cold, but there was something else there, an unsettling glimmer of satisfaction, as though my suffering proved some twisted theory of hers. My stomach turned even as my throat constricted further. Sophie Martin, my best friend since primary school, shot up from her desk. 16 years old like me, her brown hair flying as she leapt to her feet, she shouted, "This is insane! She's dying!" and bolted toward the cabinet. Marianne's arm snapped out, blocking Sophie with startling speed. "Sit down," she hissed, her eyes narrowing. Then she did something that would sear itself into my memory forever. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a key, and locked the classroom door with a sharp click. The sound of the metal turning was final, a sentence handed down. She slid the key back into her pocket as if it were nothing. "No one leaves this room," she declared, her voice rising above the startled cries. "Not until Elise admits she's putting on an act." The class froze, stunned. My ears rang with the rush of my blood and the muffled gasps around me. Someone at the back screamed, "Call 112!" A flurry of movement erupted as students fumbled for their phones, but Marianne moved faster. She lunged toward the nearest desk, sweeping up the glowing rectangles with her hand, one after another, confiscating them as if they were contraband. "Anyone who disobeys me will be expelled," she barked. Her words cracked like a whip, paralyzing the room. I clutched my throat as it tightened further, my breath shallow and ragged. A metallic taste filled my mouth, and then I felt the warmth of blood trickling from my nose. Panic rose like a tide. 6 minutes, my doctor had drilled it into me during every consultation. 6 minutes before anaphylaxis crossed the point of no return. 6 minutes until my heart could stop. Suddenly, a strangled cough echoed from the other side of the room. Lucas Moreau, 17 and broad-shouldered, staggered back from his desk. His face had gone pale, his eyes watering violently. "I can't see," he gasped, his hands clawing at his swollen eyelids. Like me, Lucas had a severe peanut allergy. I realized with horror that the fine dust from the hazelnuts Marianne had been eating was now everywhere, coating desks and drifting in the air. She had deliberately scattered some onto mine earlier. Now it was killing us both. "I can't see anything," Lucas cried, his voice breaking. The room descended into chaos. Chairs scraped and toppled. Sophie hammered her fists on the locked door, shouting for help. Another student tore through backpacks, searching for an emergency injector. Clara, a quiet girl with neat braids, doubled over and vomited from sheer panic, her sobs cutting through the noise. Marianne only smiled faintly, as though watching an experiment unfold. "You're all performing for attention," she said, her voice detached and almost gleeful. Then she reached into her bag, withdrew another packet of hazelnuts, and began sprinkling them over the nearest desk like some grotesque priestess of exposure therapy. "This is called controlled desensitization," she announced. "It will toughen you." I felt my skin go clammy and pale. Foam gathered at the corners of my mouth as my body betrayed me, slipping closer to collapse. My hands trembled violently as I crawled on all fours, the world tilting and spinning. In my head, only one thought remained: break something, escape somehow. My eyes darted to the red fire extinguisher bolted to the wall. If I could smash the window, someone might see, someone might intervene. The noise around me blurred into a distant roar. Sophie's voice cut through it, high and fierce. "Help her!" she screamed, and then the sound of shattering glass filled the air as she slammed a chair into the medical cabinet. Splinters of glass cascaded to the floor like ice. Marianne moved instantly. Her fingers clamped around Sophie's wrist, twisting hard enough to make her cry out. "That's vandalism," she hissed. "You'll be expelled. I'll see to it personally." Lucas, half-blind and swaying, stumbled forward. Somehow, despite his condition, he hurled himself at Marianne, wrapping his arms around her in a desperate bid to stop her. The two of them crashed against a desk, papers scattering, Marianne's coat swinging open as the stolen key jingled in her pocket. I dragged myself toward the window, each movement a monumental effort. My body felt alien, heavy and slow. Reaching the fire extinguisher, I gripped it with trembling hands, lifted it just enough, and swung. The glass shattered in an explosion of sound, shards slicing into my palms, but I barely felt it over the firestorm raging inside my body. Cold October air rushed into the room, sharp and clean like a lifeline. Blood dripped from my hands as I fumbled for the latch. My vision flickered, darkness nibbling at the edges. Around me, the classroom was a maelstrom. Sophie shouting, Lucas grappling with Marianne, other students crying, coughing, pleading. Marianne's voice rose, a shrill command no one was listening to anymore. The smell of nuts, chalk, and fear mingled in the air. I clawed at the window frame, fingers slipping on the blood from my own cuts. Every breath was a battle, my chest heaving as if underwater. I thought of my mother's warnings, of the doctor's stern voice, of the EpiPen that was supposed to be within reach, and rage bubbled up through the haze of terror. This wasn't just negligence. This was cruelty. Somewhere behind me, Sophie screamed again, a sound of pure desperation. "Elise, hold on," she cried. Lucas grunted with effort, still pinning Marianne as she struggled to free herself. I managed to wedge the window open, the frame groaning as it gave way. Cool air streamed over my face, but my body was shutting down fast, my muscles heavy, my hands numb. I knew I had only moments left. If I collapsed now, if I lost consciousness, I might never wake up. The thought flickered across my mind like a final flare. I cannot die here. Not like this. The din of the classroom faded into a dull roar. The only thing I could hear clearly was my own ragged breathing and the frantic hammering of my heart. I forced my trembling fingers to find the latch, the way you remember the shape of a key in the dark. Slipped once, twice, but then it gave. The window swung outward with a screech of metal. I slumped against the sill, gasping, feeling the rush of open space beneath me. Behind me, chaos reigned. Marianne shouting, students crying, Sophie calling my name over and over. But in that moment, all I could think was, there is a way out. My vision swam as I pulled myself up, using the last of my strength to brace against the frame. blood from my cut hands smeared across the white paint. The October wind whipped at my face, carrying the distant sounds of the schoolyard. My heart thundered in my ears, each beat a countdown. 6 minutes. The number was a drum in my mind. I didn't know if anyone outside had heard the glass shatter, if help was on its way, or if Sophie had managed to grab an injector from the wrecked cabinet. All I knew was that I had to act now before the world went black. The window gave way with a final keening sound and I tumbled out into the narrow corridor, air rushing into my lungs as if it had been waiting there all along. My legs folded awkwardly beneath me, and for a moment the world was nothing but light and the hot, metallic taste of blood on my tongue. Then feet, many feet, thumped down the hall. Voices rose in a single, shocked chord. 112. Call 112. Someone yelled. Cry cut through the fog in my head like a rope thrown to pull me back. I heard Marianne Leclerc shrieking from the classroom behind me, her voice raw with outrage. They're faking. It's a collective performance. But it sounded distant, as if it belonged to someone else's life. By the time the first teachers burst into view, the school nurse and 2 other staff members were already at my side. Warm, urgent hands steadied me. Someone pressed a radio and another voice answered with calm, efficient commands. For a second, I clung to the solidity of those hands like a child, then blurred into nothingness. When I came back, it was to the harsh antiseptic of the infirmary and the bright, clinical faces of EMTs leaning close. An EpiPen had been fired into my thigh, rapid, correct, and another into Lucas's. The nurse's mouth moved. You flatlined 3 minutes, she said, and the words landed strange and heavy in my chest. 3 minutes. A number that had been a ghost in my head now had a shape. Lucas survived, but not whole. The hazelnut dust had swollen his eyes until the retinas were scarred. Doctors told us he would never regain more than 30% of his vision. I remember the way his voice quivered when he tried to joke about it, how the attempt at lightness fell apart into something raw and afraid. He held my hand that night in the hospital like a promise. I wished, then and there, for anything that would spare him the darkness he feared. 2 weeks later, the school buzzed with a quieter, more dangerous energy. Marianne Leclerc had been dismissed the day after the incident. The school board had moved quickly under pressure. Rumors said she had been banned from teaching across France, a severe professional death sentence. For a while, there was a strange, mechanical satisfaction in hearing her name whispered with contempt. But satisfaction ran out like breath. The real news came a week after. Lucas could not bear the new shape of his life. He took his own life. The announcement was a blow that flattened the classroom, the town, the small orbit of people who had known him. The funeral was a quiet, bitter thing, candles and photographs and the hard, stupid refusal that sometimes comes with grief. When Mrs. Dufour, our homeroom teacher, told us, the room folded inward. Sophie gripped my hand under the desk. Her fingers were tight and small and trembling. Her eyes were wet, but they had fire in them too. Firing her isn't enough, she whispered, low and urgent. She has to be accountable. She has to pay for what she did. I could feel her breath on my knuckles, steady, steady, like an anchor. We began to move. Grief and fury make for strange, efficient partners. Sophie started a class chat and invited the people who had been in the room that day. Clara, who'd vomited in panic, Julian, who had smashed the cabinet, and to my surprise and discomfort, Antoine, my ex, who had been one of the first to call me an actress in the scramble. He accepted the invite with a curt apology that didn't sound like one. Maybe he was ashamed. Maybe he'd simply been shocked into clarity. Either way, he was there. We cataloged everything, and for the first time the procedural part of me took over, the part that had learned to order chaos into lists to make evidence a kind of armor. We typed out, line by line, exactly what Marianne had said, the total silence contract, the way she blocked Sophie, the cold, small laugh when we begged for help. We time-stamped the key moments, the click of the lock, the second she confiscated phones, the precise minute I began to bleed from my nose. Clara recorded the audio she'd taken when Marianne lectured us about controlled desensitization. Julian, who still had blood on his hands from breaking the cabinet glass, photographed the shards and the bent lock. Even Antoine, with hands that still trembled, transcribed the teacher's notes about exposure therapy from her bag. We built a chronology because anger alone is messy. Chronology can be handed to someone impartial, a lawyer, an investigator, and turned into culpability. Sophie insisted we approach the local prosecutor. "They can't let this be a story we stew about in whispers," she said. "If people forget, if the record is vague, if Marianne gets some sympathetic myth about unconventional methods, then Lucas will have died for nothing." She had a voice like a hammer then, sure, resolute. I wanted it to be true. I was not immune to doubt. There were nights when the dark pressed against my ribs and I replayed that classroom in my head, frame by frame, until every sound and glance felt fluorescent. I wondered if we were seeking justice or revenge, or if the difference even mattered anymore. Wanting Marianne to suffer as we had suffered would not bring Lucas back. But letting her go unpunished felt wrong in my bones, an acceptance that civility and credentials could hide cruelty without consequence. That thought made my stomach twist. So we collected witness statements and medical reports. We pressed the school for the policy that had been ignored, the medical form noting my peanut allergy, the emergency protocol for anaphylaxis, the whereabouts of the first aid kit. We copied security footage from the hallways. Sophie compiled the chat logs and Clara organized the audio files. Julian met with a parent who worked at a legal clinic and got advice on pressing charges. Antoine, clumsy with contrition, knocked on doors and handed out copies of our file to other parents until murmurs turned into a petition. Each piece of paper felt like a small, stubborn refusal to let the moment be erased. Each recorded sentence made Marianne's denials harder to sustain. But every action also opened wounds anew. Photos of Lucas's swollen eyes, the EpiPen needle marks, my own hospital bracelet, things that made me flinch in the night. Sophie would catch me staring at the chronology and squeeze my hand. "We'll do this for him," she would say. For Lucas. We moved with the careful fury of people who had nothing to lose and everything to claim. The law was slow, but the file grew. In the quiet between meetings, I found myself returning again and again to a smaller, more private truth. The task wasn't just to make Marianne answer in some abstract legal sense. It was to make the world remember that cruelty disguised as pedagogy is still cruelty, that authority without empathy is a danger, that the thin, bureaucratic words on a form, allergy, EpiPen, emergency protocol, are not optional. The chat buzzed late into the nights that followed. Voices drafting statements, checking each other's memories, sharing small comforts. We were a ragged, determined collective, bound by the memory of a classmate who should have lived. I clung to that as much as to Sophie's hand. Justice meant reliving the worst day of my life again and again, then so be it. I would reopen the wound if that is what it took to keep it from happening to someone else. My mother drove me to the police station the next morning, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. I sat beside her, silent, watching the Parisian suburbs slide past the window like a gray blur. At the station, a tall man with tired eyes introduced himself as Officer Pierre Fournier. He led us into a small room with beige walls and a flickering fluorescent light. He took out a notepad and asked me to start from the beginning. His questions were careful but relentless. He kept circling back to the same detail, the locked door. "You're certain she locked it from the inside?" He asked for the third time. "Yes," I whispered. My throat tightened with the memory. He nodded gravely. "That's not just negligence. That's unlawful confinement." He wrote something down, then looked at me again, as if weighing how much a 16-year-old could handle. But outside the station, the world was far less sympathetic. Within days, rumors began to spread at school and on social media. Some classmates muttered that we had exaggerated, that Lucas's death was about his own weakness, not about what had been done to us. The cruelty of their words left me breathless. Even Antoine, my ex-boyfriend who had once held my hand in the cafeteria, posted a long status accusing me of creating drama for attention. When I received his private message, a clumsy apology wrapped in excuses, I blocked him without a reply. The administration wasn't much better. Principal Bernard Lefebvre summoned my mother and me to his office. He sat behind a polished desk, his tie loosened but his voice formal. "We must handle this discreetly," he said. "The school's reputation," my mother shot to her feet, eyes blazing. "Discreetly? My daughter nearly died because of your teacher," she snapped, pointing a trembling finger at him. "And Lucas is dead." The air in the room turned heavy, like a storm had rolled in. We left without shaking his hand. Silence, however, was not an option for Sophie. She became the driving force behind our response. In the weeks after Lucas's funeral, she organized a campaign she called Lucas Law, demanding mandatory allergy safety measures in every French classroom. She created a petition, wrote letters, and rallied parents. Tonight, she sent me updates in our group chat, her messages glowing like little sparks on my phone screen. Clara signed on, Julian joined too, and even Antoine, ironically, was still in the chat, lurking but silent. We also sought legal help. My mother contacted a lawyer named Camille Dubois, a sharp-eyed woman with a reputation for taking on schools. In her office lined with case files, she laid out a grim history. 3 years earlier, Leclerc had refused to let a diabetic student test his blood sugar until he fainted. Another time, she had confiscated an inhaler from an asthmatic child who ended up in the hospital. Each time, complaints were buried, her record wiped clean as she was quietly transferred to a new post. Listening to this, my stomach twisted. It was like discovering that the nightmare I'd survived had been rehearsed before. But the backlash only grew. Leclerc posted a tearful video on YouTube, claiming she was a victim of cancel culture. In the comments, strangers called us spoiled children seeking fame. Sophie began receiving death threats from anonymous accounts. I started waking at night with my throat clenched shut, as if the allergen had followed me into my dreams. My mother found me one dawn sitting on the kitchen floor, clutching a glass of water, trembling. Eventually, the school installed unlocked EpiPen boxes in every classroom. A small, cold victory. When I passed one for the first time, the blue plastic glinting under the hall lights, it felt less like progress and more like an afterthought, a monument to what had already been lost. Lucas was gone, and nothing, no policy or petition, could bring him back. Till Sophie refused to stop. "Too late for him doesn't mean too late for others," she whispered one afternoon, sliding a new flyer across my desk. Her hands shook, but her eyes were steady. Looking at her, I felt something flicker inside me, a fragile thread of purpose tugging me forward through the grief. During one of our investigations, we uncovered a chilling piece of her past. Marianne Leclerc had once worked at a summer camp in Normandy, and a former colleague, now a nurse, recalled how she boasted that her parents had cured her allergies by locking her in a room filled with cats. The same witness told us about another incident. A child allergic to fish was forced to eat it, allegedly as a psychological test. These revelations were horrifying but crucial. They convinced the prosecutor that Marianne's behavior was not a one-off lapse in judgment but a dangerous pattern. The charges escalated to child endangerment and unlawful confinement, finally holding her accountable in the eyes of the law. The fight, however, wasn't over. The greatest shock came from within our own circle. Antoine, a student in our class, betrayed our trust. He captured screenshots from our private chat group and sent them to a blogger sympathetic to Marianne. The messages were doctored to make it seem as though we were fabricating everything for attention or financial gain. The backlash was swift. Our peers recoiled, whispers spread like wildfire, and the press labeled us liars chasing money. The betrayal cut deeper than any courtroom verdict could. Even as we stood our ground, the social humiliation was a constant weight on our shoulders. Despite the obstacles, justice eventually prevailed. We won the civil lawsuit against Marianne Leclerc and the school. Compensation covered 5 years of hospital bills and psychological therapy, but more importantly, it forced the school to implement clear policies allowing students to speak openly about allergy safety. Lucas Law spread rapidly, adopted by over 300 schools across Europe, a living legacy to the boy we had lost. Standing in front of the French National Assembly, my hands trembling as I held an EpiPen, I addressed lawmakers about mandatory allergy training for teachers. The words felt raw in my mouth, each syllable a tribute to Lucas, a call to prevent another tragedy. Watching Marianne face her criminal trial, handcuffed and stripped of authority, I felt a measure of relief, though the grief for Lucas never truly left me. Even today, the smell of peanut butter still sends shivers through me. Yet in that anguish, there was purpose. We had turned tragedy into change. Lucas would not return, but no other child should suffer as he did. Through this journey, I learned 3 powerful lessons. When courage often comes from necessity, not desire. I never wanted to confront Marianne or stand up to the entire school system, but the danger forced me to act. Sometimes, courage is simply surviving and refusing to stay silent in the face of injustice. 2 collective action amplifies a single voice. Sophie, Clara, Julian, and even reluctant allies like Antoine became part of something larger than themselves. Together, our voices became impossible to ignore. Change rarely happens alone. It is built through solidarity and persistence. Healing does not erase pain but transforms it into purpose. The grief for Lucas, the nightmares, and the fear of peanuts will never fully disappear. But channeling that pain into advocacy, policy change, and public awareness gave it meaning. Suffering became the engine for reform, ensuring that tragedy could be a lesson, not a repetition. If you've been moved by our story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Every view helps spread awareness, ensures that students everywhere have safer schools, and honors Lucas' memory. Change begins when voices refuse to be silenced. Let's make sure no one else suffers in silence.